No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 16. The Sacking of Panama and the Sinking of Jamaica. By the summer of 1670, as might be expected, the tenuous truce between the Spaniards and the English had already begun to unravel, thanks mostly to Spanish desire for revenge against Morgan's raids. Several English ships were seized, and along the unprotected coasts of Jamaica, Spanish marauders landed and attacked plantations. Without waiting for messages to travel to and from England, Modiford declared war on his own. In a commission issued July 22nd, Morgan was authorized to land in the enemy's country as many of his men as he shall think needful, and then accordingly take, destroy, and dispose of, and to do and perform all manner of exploits. Thus did Admiral Henry Morgan set out upon his last and greatest adventure. So great was Morgan's fame by now that almost 2,000 buccaneers on 36 ships, by far the largest such assemblage yet seen in the Indies, answered the call to rendezvous near Cape Tiburon, Hispaniola, on December 2nd, 1670. Largest of the vessels was Morgan's new flagship, the 22-gun frigate Satisfaction. Of the remaining ships, 13 carried 10 guns or more. The 5 smallest mounted no guns, but they could still transport armed men of fierce disposition. At the customary council of war, Morgan seems to have left open the question of where the buccaneers should first strike, but he could only have been delighted when his captains selected the city of Panama. Yes, Panama, the heart of Spain's New World, the citadel on the Isthmus Pacific coast, the treasure house of gold and silver. Drake had dreamed of taking it, but not even that great captain had been able to fulfill his vision. The prize remained untouched, beckoning now to Henry Morgan. His fleet left Cape Tiburon on December 8th, and in a week covered the 575 miles to the flyspeck island of Old Providence, about midway between Jamaica and Portobello. Once a favorite buccaneer's anchorage, the island had recently been captured by the Spaniards. Upon Morgan's arrival, the island's governor surrendered and asked only that Morgan stage a face-saving show of force with unshotted cannon. Morgan was happy to oblige, and he now had a base about 300 miles from the mouth of the Chagres River, from which he would launch his strike against Panama. From Old Providence, Morgan sent an advance party of 470 hand-picked men to storm the castle of San Lorenzo, which guarded the mouth of the Chagres River, up which the expedition would have to travel on its approach to Panama. The buccaneers reached the fort on December 26th and found that an attack by sea would be out of the question. The bastion's powerful guns outranged the ship's cannon. So the buccaneers left their sloops in a sheltered cove and sliced through the jungle for an assault by land. They took the fort, but only after a savage fight that lasted almost 24 hours and cost the buccaneers more than 100 casualties. Nevertheless, the road to Panama now lay open. From the mouth of the Chagres River to the village of Venta de Cruces, itself a hard day's march from Panama, was a direct distance of only 25 miles. Yet such were the serpentine twists and turns of the sullen river that it took almost 75 miles by boat. Leaving behind 400 men to garrison San Lorenzo Fort and thereby cover his rear, the admiral and 1,400 buccaneers started upriver in 7 shallow draft sloops and 36 riverboats and canoes. But the rainy season had come to an end. The river was consequently low, and at least 5 times they were forced to portage their heavy craft. Finally, after 4 days, they gave up and set out on foot through a jungle of towering trees, bamboo thickets, tangling vines, tearing thorns, swamps of rotting, stinking vegetation, biting insects, alligators, and terrifying snakes whose venom could kill within minutes. Almost every tortured step of the way had to be hacked out with machetes. The men traveled light. Arms and ammunition took precedence over even food and water, hoping to seize provisions at Venta de Cruces. But word of their coming had preceded them. They found the village empty and in flames, torched by its own inhabitants. The hungry buccaneers had already marched for 7 dreadful days. It was too late for them to turn back. They could only move on into the perpetual gloom of the forest. About noon, 2 days later, January 17th, Henry Morgan and his men staggered out of the jungle onto the broad savanna. Morgan's advance guard climbed a hill, known forever after as El Cerro de los Bucaneros, and saw for the first time the gleaming blue Pacific, with the sparkling city of Panama resting beside the wide bay, a sight for the eyes and the spirit to feast upon. But there below them they saw something else, something even more to their present tastes. At the foot of the hill, hundreds of cattle were grazing placidly in grass as high as their withers. The starving buccaneers fell upon the animals and, recounted Esquemeling, such was their hunger that they more resembled cannibals than Europeans at this banquet, the blood many times running down from their beards onto the middle of their bodies. Glutted now with beef, the buccaneers continued their march and in early evening came upon the enemy. Arrayed in line on the savanna before them as if planning to fight in a classical battle in the wilds of Central America were the Spanish forces, 600 cavalry, 2,100 foot soldiers, all under Panama's viceroy, Don Perez de Guzman. The two opposing forces bivouacked for the night, and when Don Perez awoke the next morning, he discovered that 2/3 of his men, terrified by accounts of the brutality of the buccaneers, had fled back to Panama. Perez realized now that he was no match for Morgan in the flat, open grassland, so he gathered those of his troops that remained and headed for Panama. There he rallied an impromptu army of 1,700 from among the citizens and waited for Morgan to bring on the buccaneers. Perez formed up his forces east of the city, with his artillery in the front. Behind the guns, he himself commanded the center. A squadron of cavalry covered his left, while his right was secured, or so he supposed, by a steep hill. His plan was to wait until the buccaneers charged his center, then blast them with his cannon. As the buccaneers reeled from the effects of the barrage, the cavalry would gallop ahead to scatter the enemy. Then Perez meant to throw into the battle an extraordinary force, 2 great herds of oxen and bulls, driven thither by 50 cowkeepers on purpose to disorder the enemy. After the cattle had been stamped into the enemy, Perez's infantry would then move forward to mop up. But Perez was completely outgeneraled. Morgan, his own force divided into 3, with he himself commanding the center, quickly spotted the flaw in the Spanish position. He could reach the hill on his left, and from that vantage point storm the Spaniards on their undefended right flank. Moreover, Morgan's detachment might be able to reach the hill unseen, since the sun was glaring into the Spanish eyes and a light breeze was wafting smoke from preliminary gunfire across their front, further obscuring their vision. Morgan sent 300 men up to capture the hill. At that point, an impetuous Spanish cavalry commander, unable to wait for Don Perez's plan to unfold, led a wild charge against the buccaneers' center. Morgan's men coolly formed a square and broke the charge, felling the rash commander in the process. Now Perez was committed. He urged his men to follow him into battle. He later recounted of the experience that, "I went directly to the enemy, and hardly did our men see some fall dead and others wounded, but they turned their backs and fled, leaving me there with only a pair of servants that followed me." Perez somehow escaped the English, and, desperately trying to recoup, signaled his cowkeepers to unleash the cattle. But like everything else for the Spaniards that day, the stampede proved a dismal failure. Esquemeling later described the action as, "The greatest part of the wild cattle ran away, being frightened with the noise of the battle, and some few that broke through the English companies did no harm rather than to tear the colors in pieces, whereas the buccaneers, shooting them dead, left not one to trouble them." Perez and the remnants of his army fled into the hills, and by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Morgan and his men had entered Panama. But their sweet triumph soon turned to bitter disaster. A fire started in a home, and soon the entire city was ablaze. The cedar and superbly worked rosewood houses, the magnificent churches, and even the king's stables that housed treasure-bearing mules, all fueling a giant conflagration. How the fire started is unknown, but for the buccaneers who were counting on booty and ransom, it was pure calamity. Morgan later wrote to Modiford, "There we were, forced to put the fire out of the enemy's houses, but it was all in vain, for by 12 at night it was all consumed. That famous and ancient city of Panama, which is the greatest mart for silver and gold in the entire world." Much of Panama's wealth had been hurriedly carried away by ship when the Spaniards first learned of Morgan's impending attack. More treasure was lost in the firing of the city. But during the 20 days that the buccaneers picked through Panama's smoking ruins, they collected a tidy enough sum, valuables worth some 400,000 pieces of eight, or about 100,000 pounds. Still, by the time the spoils were divided according to the articles signed at the beginning of the expedition, 10,000 pounds to the king's brother, the Duke of York, who was also High Lord Admiral, 6,666 to the king, and 1,000 to Morgan, only about 50 pounds apiece filtered down to the rank and file. There was, inevitably, loud grumbling. Escamilling, years later, wrote that the buccaneers thought Morgan had withheld much of the loot from them, but there is no evidence of it, and it is unlikely on the face of it. The cardinal buccaneer rule was fair division of the spoils, and Morgan was a buccaneer to the core. Yet now Morgan's glory days on the Spanish Main were drawing to a close. Upon his return to Jamaica, he found that the political winds had once again shifted. The Duke of Albemarle was dead. Modiford and Morgan no longer had a great friend at court. Worse yet, at least from Morgan's viewpoint, England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid on July 18, 1670, prohibiting either party from pillaging and privateering in the Indies. Since the treaty for the first time officially recognized English holdings in the Caribbean, it was a diplomatic triumph for Charles II, but it would put a crimp in Morgan's style. News of the treaty did not reach the Caribbean until May 1671, long after Morgan had embarked on his Panama raid. But now the Spanish ambassador in London was outraged and called the raid a flagrant violation of the peace. He demanded that both Modiford and Morgan be punished, and he threatened to overturn the treaty if they were not. The king buckled. Modiford was deposed as governor, and on August 15, 1671, he was placed under arrest on the frigate Assistance. He was taken to England and clapped into the Tower of London, where he remained for 2 years. Morgan, too, was returned to England, but not until April 4, 1672, when he was taken as His Majesty's prisoner on board the ironically named Welcome for a 12-week voyage home. Though technically under arrest, he was not confined on the ship or when he reached England. The reason is unclear, but it was probably that Henry Morgan was a popular hero, the talk of London coffee houses, the toast of the taverns. Within a year, the king's advisers had taken to consulting Morgan about the West Indies, and the force of Morgan's personality had evidently not diminished an iota. Even Charles II was impressed. In August 1673, when Morgan submitted a memorandum to him outlining Jamaica's military weaknesses, the king decided that he wanted Morgan back in the Caribbean. In an astounding reversal of fortune, Morgan was designated Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica on January 23, 1674. And soon thereafter he knelt before his monarch, received the touch of a blade upon his shoulders, and arose as Sir Henry Morgan, Knight. He returned to Jamaica almost exactly 3 years after he had left it, and by every right his twilight years on the island should have been golden ones. He had a title, he was rich, he was granted a royal patent for another 4,000 acres, giving him a total of 6,000 and making him one of the island's wealthiest planters. But the sedentary life did not become Henry Morgan. He spent his days and nights roistering from tavern to tavern, boasting loudly of his past exploits, denouncing old enemies and making new ones, being carried home in a stupor. On May 14, 1682, he was relieved as lieutenant governor. In 1683, he was ousted from membership in Jamaica's governing council for his passions and irregularities. His doctors told him to cut down on his drinking. Instead, he increased it. One physician wrote, "His belly swelled so as not to be contained in his coat." His legs also became bloated, and he was hardly able to move from the hammock in which he rested by day on the veranda of his mansion in Port Maria, across the island from Port Royal. Toward the end, he called upon the services of a Jamaican witch doctor who, according to the disapproving English physician, gave him enemas of urine and plastered him all over with clay and water. On Saturday, August 25th, 1688, the captains of the English warships Assistance and Drake, then anchored off Port Royal, were ordered to fire memorial salutes. The captain of the Assistance wrote in his log, "This day, about 11 hours morning, Sir Henry Morgan died. He was 53. Nearly 4 years later, the morning of Tuesday, June 7th, 1692, was oppressively still and sultry. Some of the Port Royal citizens later remarked that the ceaseless waves were no longer breaking against the old cagway. By noon, the Reverend Dr. Emmanuel Heath, rector of St. Peter's Church, a building Henry Morgan had largely financed, having already read prayers to keep some show of religion among the most ungodly people, had repaired to a nearby tavern to sip a glass of wormwood wine with Jamaica's acting governor, John White. Suddenly, Heath later wrote, "I found the ground rolling and moving under my feet, upon which I said, 'What could this be?' White replied very composedly, being a very grave man, 'It is an earthquake. Be not afraid. It will soon be over.'" The acting governor was a poor prophet. As the tremors increased, Heath ran toward Fort Morgan, which had a wide open courtyard surrounded by walls. As he made his way towards that courtyard, he later writes, "I saw the earth open up and swallow a multitude of people, and the sea mounting in upon us over the fortifications." He survived by making his way to the harbor and boarding a sloop, just as the sea engulfed the wharf and all the shops on it. Another survivor told of whole streets sinking under water with men, women, and children in them, and those houses which but now just appeared the fairest and loftiest in the parts were all at a moment sunk down to the earth, nothing to be seen of them again. And still another witness lived to report that most ghastly sight of all, that of persons whom the earth received up to their necks, and then closed upon them to squeeze them to death with their heads above ground, many of which the dogs then ate. More than 2,000 people died on that day. 1/3 of Port Royal crumbled away and sank into the sea. In one fluky and perhaps symbolic incident, a tidal wave raised by the earthquake carried a ship on its crest into what was left of Port Royal and deposited it safely in the marketplace. The vessel was French, a prize recently taken from the nation with which England was now at war, and whose privateers would dominate the next Caribbean era now that the English power had been dealt a devastating, though temporary, setback. And old Harry Morgan's grave, on a plot seized by the sea, now lay 5 fathoms deep.